The Cold War was a state of political and military tension after World War II between powers in the Western Bloc, which were the United States, its NATO allies, and others, and powers in the Eastern Bloc, which were the USSR and its allies in the Warsaw Pact. There has been no agreement to the exact period of time the Cold War occurred. The years 1947 to 1991 are the most common. As mentioned before, there is a disagreement among historians regarding the starting point of the Cold War. While most historians trace its origins to the period immediately following World War II, others argue that it began with the October Revolution in Russia in 1917 when the Bolsheviks took power. Vladimir Lenin stated that the new Soviet Union was surrounded by a hostile capitalist encirclement, and he viewed diplomacy as a weapon to keep Soviet enemies divided, beginning with the establishment of the Comintern, which called for revolutionary upheavals abroad. His successor Joseph Stalin viewed the USSR as a socialist island, stating it must see that the present capitalist encirclement is replaced by a socialist encirclement. The first phase of the Cold War began in the first 2 years after the end of the Second World War in 1945. The USSR consolidated its control over the states of the Eastern Bloc, while the United States began a strategy of global containment to challenge Soviet power, extending military and financial aid to the countries of Western Europe and creating the NATO allies. The Berlin blockade was the first major crisis of the Cold War. It occurred on 1948 and lasted until 1949. With the victory of Communist side in the Chinese Civil War and the outbreak of the Korean War, the conflict expanded. The USSR and the USA competed for influence in Latin America and the decolonizing states of Africa and Asia. Meanwhile, the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 had been stopped by the Soviets. The expansion and escalation sparked more crises, such as the Suez Crisis in 1956, the Berlin Crisis 1961, and the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Following the Cuban Missile Crisis, a new phase began that saw the Sino-Soviet split, complicated relationships within the communist sphere, while U.S. allies, particularly France, demonstrated greater independence of action. The USSR crushed the 1968 Prague Spring Liberation Program in Czechoslovakia and the Vietnam War, and ended with a defeat on the U.S. Big Republic of South Vietnam, prompting further adjustments. The United States had a capitalist government. This form of government came from Adam Smith's writing, where he emphasizes on the idea that consisted on businesses that people owned rather than the government. During the Cold War, the U.S. presidents who were in office were Franklin D. Roosevelt and Harry S. Truman, who followed liberal democracy ideologies. This means the people chose its leader that was going to take his place in the government through voting. Also, they would be granted rights like freedom of speech and press. In the economy, people were supposed to be able to compete with each other, with the government interfering the less possible, and make as much money as they wished. In other words, individuals are motivated to put effort in their work and work hard by the promise of individual reward. During this time, the people established free trade, where they would trade their products with other countries, which caused a lot of competition between the business and people, since each individual wanted to sell or trade their product, because it was the best, which would cause them to gain great amounts of money. On the other hand, communism was the ideology followed by the Soviet Union. In fact, the Soviet Union was totalitarian, meaning all the power was with the rulers. It was principally created by Karl Marx, and it stated that everything should be owned by the government and then divided up equally among the people who would then all work for it. In other words, it was a way of organizing a society in which major industries are owned and controlled by the government rather than by the individual people and companies. Politically, the West believed that there is only a one-party state, since it was thought to truly represent all the views of the people. They believed that the only way of creating a better world of peace, freedom, justice, and plenty for everyone would be by spreading the Soviet style of communism globally. Their conclusion was that basically, what was good for the Soviet Union was the best for all the rest of the world and its hard workers. It is important to understand the historical context in which Joseph Stalin, a Soviet leader supporting communism, developed a rudderless regime. It created paranoia and violence in which there were operations launched there all opposers had to be eliminated. This ideology was something the leaders in general of the Soviet Union stubbornly believed in, took severe measure to achieve, and thought that should dominate all the world.
Comunica a la población que a partir de la fecha el país se encuentra bajo el control operacional de la Junta Militar. Se recomienda a todos los habitantes el estricto acatamiento a las disposiciones y directivas que emanen de autoridad militar, de seguridad o policial, así como extremar el cuidado en evitar acciones y actitudes individuales o de grupo que puedan exigir la intervención drástica del personal en operaciones. Firmado Jorge Rafael Videla, Teniente General, Comandante General del Ejército.
Moreover, the 1976 Argentine coup was a right-wing coup that overthrew Isabel Perón as President of Argentina on March 24, 1976. Jorge Rafael Videla, general of a military junta, was installed to replace Perón. Not only was Videla in this group, he had company of the Admiral Emilio Eduardo Macera and Brigadier General Orlando Ramón Agosti. The junta took the official name of National Reorganization Process. It remained in power until December 10, 1983. Before the coup, there was a political repression that was occurring, and it kept heavily extending toward the end of the coup. The result of the impact those years had brought more than 30,000 people, forced disappearances, and many others were killed. The coup was planned since October 1975. The United States Department of State learned of the preparations 2 months before execution. As mentioned before, the junta was officially named National Reorganization Progress. In Argentina, this is also simply known as La Última Junta Militar, or La Última Dictadura, since there have been several. The Argentine military seized political power during March 1976. It aimed violent factional conflicts between supporters of recently deceased President Juan Domingo Perón. The junta continued the Dirty War. After losing the Falkland War to the United Kingdom in 1982, the junta faced mounting public opposition and finally surrendered power in 1983. The Dirty War was simply the name used by the Argentine military government for a period of state terrorism in Argentina. This occurred roughly from 1974 to 1983, during which military and security forces and right-wing death squads in the form of Argentine anti-communist alliances hunted down and killed left-wing guerrillas, political dissidents, and anyone who was associated with socialism. The victims of this violence that was occurring were about 7,158 left-wing activists, terrorists, and militiants, including trade unionists, students, journalists, and Marxists and Peronist guerrillas, and their support from networks in the Monteros, who believed to be 150,000, 250,000, and 60,000 in the ERP. Official members of the disappearances were reported to be 13,000. Other 10,000 were guerrillas of the Monteros and the Marxist People Revolutionary Army, the ERP. On the other hand, leftist guerrilla caused at least 6,000 casualties among the military, police forces, and civilian populations. The disappeared, including those thought to be a political or ideological threat to the military junta, even vaguely, and they were killed in the attempt by the junta to silence the opposition and break determination of guerrillas. The severest repression occurred after the guerrillas were largely defeated in 1977, when the church, labor unions, artists, intellectuals, university students, and professors were all targeted.
En nuestro país han desaparecido personas. Esta es una tristísima realidad, pero que objetivamente debemos reconocer. Tal vez lo difícil sea explicar el por qué y por vía de quién esas personas han desaparecido.
Si están vivos, si están muertos. ¿Por qué no nos dicen? Si le buscamos eso nada más. Que nos respondan nada más, después nos retiramos.
Lo que el gobierno diga no es que dice mentira, miente. Hace 2 años que estamos así. Mi hija estaba embarazada de 5 meses cuando se la llevaron. Mi nieto tiene que haber nacido en agosto del año pasado. Hasta ahora no he podido saber nada de él.
Nosotros solamente queremos saber dónde están nuestros hijos, vivos o muertos. Angustia porque no sabemos si están enfermos, si tienen frío, si tienen hambre, no sabemos nada. Y desesperación, Señor, porque ya no sabemos a quién recurrir. Consulados, embajadas, ministerios, iglesias, todas partes se nos han cerrado, las puertas. Por eso les rogamos a ustedes, son nuestra última última esperanza. Por favor, ayúdennos, ayúdennos, por favor. Son nuestra última.
The Cold War basically consisted in the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union for control from before World War II had ended. The U.S. was a capitalist country. As mentioned before, the presidents during this time were Franklin D. Roosevelt and Harry S. Truman, while the Soviet Union was a communist country with their president Joseph Stalin. They would fight through other countries, proxy wars. They never trusted each other, though they got together in order to defeat the Nazi. Stalin remakes the fact that the U.S. and Great Britain didn't share nuclear power research with them. Also, he was angry since the U.S. offered post-war relief loans to Great Britain but not to the USSR. During the Argentine coup, 30,000 people were disappearing during these times. Soldiers entered without permission to people's houses, armed and took whatever they wanted. They looked for books with left-side content and authors. Not only that, but there were concentration camps where victims were humiliated, abused, in many cases murdered. Pregnant women were held in captivity, and their children were born and adopted by family or militias. Since then, 114 children have been found, and most mothers are not localized. It is said that many of them were tortured, released, or killed. Additionally, there were many disappearances, especially students from universities, specifically those that militarized most to the left called Estudiantes Revolucionarios del Pueblo or Monteros. The Argentine coup was a dictatorship that affected the whole Argentine nation and created fear amongst the people. The ideology of the military dictatorship was simple: communism, a social revolution, and the possible domination of the radical socialists and communists were completely feared. This was the same as what was happening during the Cold War, a fight of ideologies. The United States was responsible for the coups all throughout South America, like the case of Chile or Argentina. The two superpowers sometimes went beyond them borders and pushed for what is today known as regime change. They spread the conflict outside of their country with proxy wars, in which they used other territories in order to fight their conflicts. It is known that the CIA in particular was directly involved in several Cold War-era coups that disciplined leftist regimes, replacing them with military dictatorships such as the one of Videla. As stated before, both sides believed that their form of economic and political mythology would be the best for all the world. Because of this, spreading their ideas, controlling other countries, and exterminating any opposers throughout the continents were the actions they took. These extreme political ideas led to the 300 clandestine centers created by the military government, where they carried out methods of repression such as kidnapping, detention, torture, and in most cases execution. Not only this, but the violation of the rights of civilians, where the Constitution had not been respected.